This video has been made with the purpose of education and awareness of real crimes, and there is no disrespect intended to anyone. This is to help promote truth and justice for anyone who has been a victim of crime. What I'm about to report is what I have researched online, and I will welcome any corrections should they be required. Hello little berry true crime fans, Zeri here. I'm just going to pretty much dive straight into this case because it is extremely heavy. It's very emotional. It's a case that do you know what? I've actually had it up to here with this case. I have been researching it for a long time. I knew about it for a while. It has to be one of the most upsetting cases I've covered on this channel, and I will give a number of trigger warnings at the beginning. Trigger warnings are incest and sexual assault of a minor. If any of these are triggering to you and you don't want to hear anything like that, then I'll understand if you can't continue with this video. Please click off, and thank you very much for watching so far. It centres around the Steenkamp family of Griekwastad in the Northern Cape province of South Africa. The Northern Cape province is mostly rural, or there's some towns and hamlets here and there, but it's actually not as densely populated as the rest of South Africa. There's a lot of rugged and arid landscape. Normally if you Google the name Steenkamp and South Africa, or just the name Steenkamp, you'll find the murder of Reva Steenkamp, who was the girlfriend of Oscar Pistorius, who is currently serving a sentence, I believe, for her murder. But there was also another murder involving a family by the name of Steenkamp, who to my knowledge are not related to Reva. We've all heard of those towns and those villages, you know, where everybody knows everybody, everything is tight-knit, there's a lot of gossip and tongues waggling. I mean, it's not a bad thing, it's what happens in small communities. Close-knit people, those that live there are very family-oriented. There are lots of family-run businesses that are passed down from generation to generation. This is no exception for the town called Griekwastad. I don't speak Afrikaans, and I'm going to try and pronounce as many things as I can here as well as I can. I absolutely love the South African accent. It's so soothing and it flows off the tongue, but I don't speak Afrikaans. If you look at Griekwastad on Google Maps or Google Earth, it's so remote. It's just this charming little village in the middle of this sort of almost like a reddish coloured landscape. It looks like there's lots of iron oxide there, but there's also lots of precious metals and precious stones. Approximately 7 to 8 kilometres away from the town is a little farm, and I believe it's pronounced Nook. I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. This is the family-run farm by the Steenkamp family. This particular farm, and also 4 others, they owned 5 farms in total, were passed down from generation to generation. And the current owner of the Nook farm at the time of this case was Deon Steenkamp. He was the youngest child, although the oldest son, of his father Don. He was married to a lady called Christelle. They met each other at university, and although Deon was going to inherit this farm anyway, he still of course had a university education. He was a very, very well educated man. And Christelle and Deon were extremely religious. There was a huge sense of moral compass in this area, that everyone jammed together and got together, and lots of community events, you know, church events and sports as well. Because it was such a farming environment, there were lots of rural type sports that you wouldn't necessarily find in other places, such as tent pegging. It's a sport played on horseback. Deon and Christelle Steenkamp were very rich. They had assets in the millions in the currency of rand. But the main thing that people always remember about the Steenkamp family is, despite their wealth, despite the fact that they could easily have afforded to live a lavish lifestyle, they didn't. They actually lived very, very modestly. They had a 1-story house on their farm, and they were very, very attentive to the animals on their farm. They kept sheep and some cattle. Because this area was so remote and not so densely populated, they needed this community spirit in order to actually, in many ways, for safety. All the farmers around that area, or most of them at least, belonged to what's called a farmers' union. And one of the things that they were very, very cautious about, which could have potentially happened, although it hadn't happened in that area, was an attack on the farm. In some areas in South Africa, farmers are targeted. They normally kill everybody. They don't leave any survivors. Money, jewellery, cars, firearms, phones, and anything that is of value are normally stolen. Just to talk a little bit about the Steenkamp children, there was Don, who was born in August of 1996. And it's very confusing sometimes because his father was Deon and his son was Don, and also Deon's father was also Don. But I'm going to do my best to make sure I differentiate between Deon and Don. They also had a daughter called Marthella, who was born in December of 1997. Both children attended boarding schools. Don attended a boys' and Marthella attended a girls' boarding school. This was quite a way away, so they couldn't have been driven to and from school. So they stayed there Monday to Friday, and on most occasions, because Deon and Christelle, they really did adore their kids, they would go and get them and bring them back for weekends as much as they possibly could and all the holidays. Sometimes that's not always possible, so they would actually visit their children at the boarding schools. But as far as I know, both kids, they did really, really well in their schooling. They were both very bright. They were both very well attentive. There was a difference, though, in their personalities, and they somehow seemed to mirror their parents. Deon was, a rather firm, although very, very fair, patriarch of the family. He was sometimes quite strict, but overall he was quite a placid person. And his son Don was also very quiet. He was very reserved, very laid back, rather shy, didn't draw too much attention to himself. He did very, very well at school. He had a few friends. Marthella, on the other hand, she was very much like her mother. Now, her mother, Christelle, although, she worked the farm just like her husband did, she also ran a successful baking company. Christelle was very on the go all the time. She was very, very busy. She wasn't someone to just, do her work and then sit in front of the television. She always had to be working, and she was someone who had a lot of feistiness in her and was very social indeed. And Marthella was very much like her mother. She was very popular. She was well liked not only at school, but in the extended Steenkamp family. It wasn't just these four. The whole of the family, Deon's parents and his older sisters, and everyone else, the grandparents, they were very, very close, and they were very much in awe at how just so ideal the Steenkamp family were. They, the 2.4 children, and the children are doing well in school. The children are very happy. Marthella was very popular, as I've said. She was extremely social. She had loads and loads of friends. She was also very physically very attractive, but she wasn't at all in any way conceited. She wasn't narcissistic in any way. Generally speaking, a very lovely, sweet young girl. Almost everybody loved her. Don was due to inherit the farm, of course, carry on the Steenkamp name. There was a lot of expectation for him, not just to do well at school, but to carry on the farm. And even though Marthella was very much like her mother in personality, and the same was for Don and Deon, it actually turned out that Marthella was actually very much a daddy's girl, and Don was very much a mummy's boy. Deon was actually a deacon at the local church. This shows how much of an upstanding member of the community he was. And Christelle, her baking business was doing really well. She had loads of friends. So the Steenkamps were actually quite an enviable family. They were rich, but they lived well within their means. They were very modest. They didn't have loads and loads of possessions to their name, and they enjoyed their farming life. Now, going back to the subject of farm attacks, they unfortunately do happen in South Africa, but in this particular part of the Northern Cape province, very rare if not unheard of. The crime rate of Griekwastad was very low if nothing. However, this peace was disrupted on Good Friday, the 6th of April 2012, between 6:50 and 6:57 p.m. that evening, when an Isuzu bakkie drove by to the local police station in Griekwastad. It stopped, and out stumbled a blood-soaked Don Steenkamp. And I mean was covered in blood. There was blood all over his arms and legs, a little bit on his t-shirt, not much, and there was some blood on his shorts. And in the car with him were two guns, a revolver and a rifle. And Don's words were, "They're all dead." Don could barely speak. It was almost like he was frozen. He was in such shock that it was very, very difficult for the police to get out of him exactly what had happened. But what he was managing to say was that his parents and his sister had been shot, had been murdered in a farm attack. The Steenkamp's extended family were contacted and they all swarmed down to the police station and immediately huddled around Don. Their main concern was him. This boy was 15 years old. He was, for all intents and purposes, a child. Yes, he had survived this and he was the crucial witness to knowing exactly what happened. The family were very, very keen to make sure that his well-being was protected at all costs because he'd been through this horrific ordeal. The police officers insisted that they did have to speak to Don, get as much information from him as possible. So they were very gentle with him, but he was clearly in such shock that he needed something. He needed something to help calm him down. So the family took him across the road. Now this shows how small and close-knit Griekwastad was that there was only one restaurant in the whole town and it was opposite the police station. They went over to the restaurant and there he was given a sweet drink. While he was there though, he said that the blood all over his hands and arms, which was drying at this moment, because it was really, really thick. He just wanted this blood off him. He felt very disgusted by it, so he did wash himself off. Conflicting accounts online say that he washed the blood off his arms at the police station and the police were happy for him to do this. Another one was that he did that at the restaurant in the restrooms there. The police were a little bit kind of, we didn't really want you to do that because you're washing away evidence. But there were some bits of blood that were so dried that he hadn't managed to get them off. So he allowed them to take swabs and also he allowed them to take his clothing for testing. When he was asked why he was so eager to get the blood off him, he said it was his sister's blood. And the reason for that was because she'd actually died in his arms. He cradled her as she died. If your sister dies in your arms in a horrific way, yes, it's not nice having blood all over you. It's not nice having any bodily fluids all over you. And you may want to have to wash it off. But he actually said he was disgusted by this blood. He was reviled by it. He just wanted to be clean. He wanted to wash the evidence of his sister's demise off him. Within the hour, the police swarmed the Steenkamp's farm, and what they found there was just absolutely horrific. All the buildings of that farm are still there, and they are still on Google Earth. Now, I've had a look at it. It's very easy to see where the house was and where the barn was. Now, the barn is actually crucial to this story. The information that Don had given to the police was that at about 6:30, he had gone into the barn to fix a light. And while he was in there, he heard gunshots. He was scared, he hid. He doesn't know how long it must have been, 10 minutes, maybe 15. He doesn't know. Everything then went quiet, and then he ran to the house. And when he ran to the house, he went in and he saw his mother and his father dead. He then saw that his sister was still alive. She was reaching for him, so he cradled her. She said, "I love you," and she died. Don was in the living room and he was laying on his front. Christelle had been at her computer doing some work for her business, I believe, and she had been shot from behind. And Marthella, it looked like she had travelled through the whole of the room and she collapsed next to her mother. And that's when her brother found her and all of her blood got onto him that way. But when the police got there, it seemed that this was not just a shooting. Deon had received several blows to the head from a blunt object. Marthella had also been beaten around the head with a blunt object. Deon had been shot in the chest, and the way that he was laying and the pattern of blood looked like he was trying to run at whoever was shooting him before he collapsed down. Christelle had been shot from behind, so she hadn't seen her attacker. But Marthella, her injuries were horrific. She'd been shot in the chest, she'd also been shot in the face, and she'd also been beaten around the face with a blunt object. It seemed that Marthella had suffered most of all. As well as the police, a neighbour of the Steenkamps called Joe Schwartz also came along because he actually was the head of the farmers' union, and his role was to help other farmers protect themselves against farm attacks. He knew what to look for with a farm attack. He knew the signs of a farm attack. He hadn't actually seen them himself. He had to study them because They didn't really happen around here, but it was a remote possibility it would. What he and the police observed was that even though this was supposedly a farm attack, there was nothing missing, or nothing that appeared to be missing, or things that were there that normally would be taken if it were a robbery. The wallets and purses, mobile phones in the master bedroom is where the gun safe was. Now, the gun safe wasn't always locked, but here it was lying open with only 2 guns missing, which were the 2 guns that Don had brought to the station. All the other guns were in there, and the ammunition. Now, guns are very valuable, ammunition is valuable. There were many, many other things around the farm or around the house that could have been taken, including the vehicles. What was the purpose of this attack? Was it a robbery that somehow went wrong and they had to kill everybody and make a quick getaway? Was this a revenge attack from staff that were let go? Because the Steenkamps did actually have staff that lived on the premises, although not actually at their house, a little way further away. There was something that was bothering Joel Schwartz as well. There were no tire tracks to show how the attacker had got there, or footprints to show how they'd arrived if they had on foot. A lot of farms would have guard dogs, or dogs at least, who would alert their owners if there were anyone around who wasn't familiar. And dogs were normally killed first, but the dogs on the farm, they were running around the place. They were not chained anywhere. There was also no sign of any break-in to the house. So whoever it was had either been let into the house, or they had another peaceful means of entering. Also, why was Deon beaten, and why was Marthella beaten? Why were these people killed in very different ways? It turned out that those 2 guns that Don had taken to the station were in fact the murder weapons. Now, this is why I've taken a bit of a break in Don's testimony, because I wanted to just give an idea about what the scene was before actually telling you this. Don actually admitted that after Marthella died, he went to his room, and even with his hands all bloody, he removed his t-shirt and put on another one. But why would he change his t-shirt and then drive to the station without calling for help? They had a landline. He had a mobile phone. As Don was driving, he noticed at the entrance at the gate, that's where the guns were. He saw them there. So he leant out of the car and picked them up. He then drove a little further to where the staff housing was, told them to get under cover because there was a farm attack. Don drove along a dirt road which was about 7-8 kilometers to Griekwastad Police Station. So in summary, nothing, as far as they know, was taken, or at least valuables that were right there that could have just been grabbed, and as they went, were still there. There was no sign of any forced entry to the house. There was also no sign, no tire tracks or footprints of anyone arriving and leaving apart from Don. And Don's version of events were also strange, that it happened to be that at 6:30 this started and he arrived at the police station. Apparently he arrived between 6:50 and 6:57. Some accounts I've seen said 6:53, some said 6:54, some said 6:50 or 6:57. Either way, if we take the longest route, that leaves 27 minutes, not only for this attack to take place, but for Don to hide, for Don to drive all that way. Even if you could physically do all of that in that time, if it started while Don was in the barn and he hid, how would he know if the perpetrators had left? How would he know that the coast was clear and everything was safe? Because he arrived in the house just as Marthella was dying. Also, why would the perpetrators leave Marthella alive? She was clearly alive because she was reaching for her brother. They would make sure she was dead before they went. It just wasn't adding up. The whole farm attack thing did not add up. But they didn't let on to the press or the public as to what their suspicions were. It was kept very, very hush-hush, to the point that it's not uncommon in villages and very small little communities for people to speculate, and then they hear something and it just goes from one person to the next, and of course the message gets distorted, and then people start to make assumptions, and if you hear someone saying something, you assume they've got it from an authentic source, or they would hear it from several people and therefore believe it to be true. There was speculation that this was not actually a farm attack but a domestic, and it was speculated that potentially Deon decided to annihilate, well, at least most of his family, and then turn the guns on himself. There were other rumours as well about Marthella supposedly being involved in a satanic cult, and that this had been a sacrifice, especially because it had happened on Good Friday. And also the fact that Don said he changed his t-shirt. Now, the police found said t-shirt in Don's room. It was blood-soaked, but it was also torn, as if somebody had grabbed at him and pulled it. Now, one thing the police did notice at the station was after they had confiscated the clothing he was wearing for testing, they noticed he had a massive scratch on his neck and some other smaller scratches, and photographs of that were taken. Is it possible that those scratches, which were very fresh, came about at the same time that this t-shirt was ripped? Had he actually been involved in this attack, in that was he actually attacked and his shirt was ripped? But if that were the case, why did the perpetrator spare him and only leave him with a scratch? How come he wasn't even beaten? How come he wasn't shot when there was plenty of ammunition? This t-shirt was dark blue, and although there was evidence of blood on this t-shirt, it was taken to the station, and when it was tested, it tested positive for gunshot residue. Also, the pattern of the blood on the shirt, it didn't just show smearing or a soaking of blood. It was small little splatters that normally would happen if you were close to somebody, either as soon as they received their injury or shortly after, because the amount of blood that would spurt out would create these very, very small little droplets and these spatters. And if someone were bleeding from an artery, that would continue for a while, but then as they lay there dying, it would lessen and lessen and it would more pool out. The day after the murders, Don Steenkamp was driven to the farm by the police so he could reiterate exactly what happened. During the drive, Don didn't seem terribly affected. Now, grief, shock, distress manifests itself differently in everybody, and we can't say this is how you're meant to behave. But he didn't seem to be showing any kind of sign of distress. There was no real emotion akin to what had happened. But he did seem very chatty. He was happy to just talk about all kinds of stuff. And when he did talk about what had happened, I drove to the station really, really fast. Like, he put pedal to the metal. The next thing he said, and this is less than 24 hours after he lost his family, he starts talking about his inheritance. Now that would definitely make the police's antennae twitch. The Steenkamps' extended family offered Don a place to stay, and although there was a school principal, I believe, and someone who lived close by who was named legally as his guardian by their father, just in case they passed away before the children were of legal age, Don decided that he wanted to go and live with the tent pegging coach from his team, who also worked with his father, although he wasn't actually a personal friend of his father, nor was he a close family friend. It also transpired that one of the neighbours, not Joe Schwartz, but another neighbour who also was a bit more familiar with this case than more people in the town, he already had suspicions about Don, and he didn't want Don in his home. The police, though, did make it clear they didn't have any suspects in mind because everything was still being looked at. Now, that's very important to remember. It was at this point that the rumours started. With farm murders, they don't need to do a lot of evidence collecting because it is self-evident. It is obvious it's a farm murder. If the police were not directly looking for suspects and they were still collecting evidence, it made people think, oh, is this actually a farm murder? Loads of evidence was collected within the 24 hours of the murder. That day afterwards, the house was cleared and cleaned. The bodies were taken away for autopsies, and this is when the extent of the injuries, like all of them, were revealed. Christelle was likely shot first, and the reason for that is she was shot from behind. If Deon had been shot first, she would have turned around to face whoever it was. so it's likely that she would have been shot in the front. But because she was shot while she was still at her computer and shot from behind, this indicated that she was actually shot first, and her death was very quick. At this point, Marthella probably ran in and she was shot twice in the chest. She then scrambled outside, and the way they know this is because of the spatter. The fact that there was so much spatter around, and it only would have come from somebody who was standing up at that place, and the trail led outside. She was desperately trying to get away. She managed to get a certain distance away where she was near a tree, and she collapsed there and bled and bled and bled. Deon, who was in the living room at the time just next to where this little lounge area was, he got up and he started to run at whoever it was. He was then shot in the chest and fell down, and then whoever it was beat him around the head and then shot him in the head. The pathologist report and the blood smearing indicated that Don hadn't died immediately as soon as he hit the ground, but had tried to pull himself along the floor, the first shots having paralysed and incapacitated him rather than killed him immediately. The perpetrator then went outside in pursuit of Marthella and found her collapsed under a tree. They beat her around the head, and then, believing that she was incapacitated or dead, returned to the house and either took her with them or Marthella returned of her own accord after she'd come to. The perpetrator then went to collect the rifle so that they could finish the job. And she actually, crucially, she went to both of her parents. There was blood, her blood, all over her parents, the spatter of blood coming out of her arteries. And when she got to her mother, she then tried to grab the landline phone and then collapsed. The police also believe that she was shot in the face very close to her death or after her death. She was shot twice in the face. When Marthella's body, though, was examined further, there was a shocking discovery. Within 24 hours, just before she died, Marthella had been raped. And there was also evidence that this was not the first time. She had sustained previous injuries to her genitalia, which had been reopened and then healed, and then this incident had reopened a wound as well. The police were already beginning to suspect that Don Steenkamp had murdered his family and covered it up to make it look like a farm attack, although not very well covered up. But this, what they found with Marthella, that she had potentially been raped by her own brother, this also provided a clear motive. If Marthella had been sexually assaulted by her brother on more than one occasion, it's likely that, which happens with sexual abuse victims, is they often keep quiet because they're worried about repercussions, especially if this person is close to them. They worry about being believed. They worry about how they will look. And that's what makes me really, really sick, is that a lot of sexual abuse or rape victims worry about how they will look. It's likely that Marthella had been the subject of her brother's sexual assault on more than one occasion, and it happened the day that she died or the day before, and that she was going to tell her parents, or Don was worried that she would tell her parents. That something was different about this incident, even though it's likely he had done this before. There was something about this incident that meant that Marthella was getting to the point where she would tell her parents. It would also explain why Marthella got the most severe death of all. Don, as I said before, was a mummy's boy. He adored his mother. And his mother at the time was at a computer, and Deon was in the living room. He shot his mother from behind, killing her pretty much instantly. She didn't get a beating. His father, he did receive a beating. His sister received 2 gunshot wounds to the chest, a severe beating around the face, and was shot in the face. This was a very personal way of annihilating somebody, getting rid of their face. But they were treated very differently. So his mother was given the most mercy, and the father was given a bit more of a severe death, and Marthella had the most severe death. He also, very quickly afterwards, returned to his school. If a child who is the survivor of a so-called farm attack has returned to the school, he's going to be treated differently to before. They're going to go quite easy on him. He's going to be given special attention, empathy, sympathy, inevitably there would be a change in Don's behaviour. He was always quiet and shy and reserved, very serious, very stoic, very much like his father. But when he returned to school, his behaviour did change. He changed from being quiet to being loud, from being reserved to being very forefront and speaking his mind. He was disruptive in lessons. He was answering back. It was actually difficult for the teachers to deal with him because they wanted to go easy on him because of what had happened, but he was making it very difficult for everyone else around him to get their education because he was so disruptive. The teachers and the parents, they were not 100% comfortable with Don being there anyway, because it was long being speculated that this was not a farm attack, that it was something very different. And although there had been no public mention by the police or by anyone that Don was under suspicion, the parents said that until Don has been cleared, unless it's specifically confirmed that he had nothing to do with it, they didn't want him there. So he was asked to leave. Following a very short legal battle, he was readmitted. He hasn't even been arrested. He hasn't been charged. There's been no mention of him being a suspect at all. So he was readmitted. After the autopsies were done, the extended family could then get on with having the funerals and the memorial services. And Don was very, very much the attention of that. People wanted to make sure that he was looked after, that he was comforted as much as possible. And as he sat in the pew, he had his grandmothers either side of him. There is footage on YouTube of this memorial, and I task you to go and have a look. I'm not the only one who's observed this. If you look at Don's face, it's red and it looks like, he's been running, that kind of red. But his face is also screwed up a lot. Now, you can make your face go red by screwing up your face and sort of like tensing yourself, so you get like a vasodilation, the blood pressure increases. But look at his eyes. No tears. Deon and his father, their attitude was don't show emotion, like males don't show emotion. And they don't cry. They have to remain very, very stoic, very poker-faced. Now that's what a lot of people said about Don. But let's not forget, Don was a child. He was 15. You're not going to be a master at putting on a poker face and not showing emotion in this kind of event. And even Deon's father, who's Don Sr., even he was crying. Conversely, if you look at Marthella's school friends who attended, they are in bits. They are crying their eyes out. And to me, Don's performance here, and it does look like a performance, looks like he's trying to make himself appear devastated. Eventually, the police had enough evidence to arrest and charge Don Steenkamp. They also added the charge of rape of his sister and also obstructing police investigations. So stopping the police from doing their job by lying to them. Although I usually don't have much sympathy for perpetrators, but this I have very mixed feelings about. When Don was arrested, he was arrested at school. He was in his class, he was called to the principal's office, and there he was arrested, and he was then paraded throughout the whole courtyard during break towards his dorm room, where the police were already searching. And when they finished searching, they paraded him all the way back in full view of everybody before taking him to the police station. So everybody knew that he'd been arrested. Other people who have done podcasts and videos on this have speculated that this was to increase pressure on him. Now, why do that to somebody? I don't even know if it was deliberate or just poor timing, as if a way to make them feel so vulnerable and so, really, really ramp up the emotions that they're more likely to break and say exactly what happened. But Don was defiant. He marched to his dorm room and then back again. Not a quiver of an emotion. The colonel who arrested Don observed this, that on the drive from the school to the station. He had the radio on, and it was announced on the radio that a 16-year-old boy, didn't name him because he was still a minor, had been arrested on suspicion of the murder of this family. The colonel looked at Don in the rearview mirror, and he saw that Don was smiling. In South Africa, the legal system is very protective of children. Now, their identities cannot be divulged until they are of legal age. And this was no different for Don Steenkamp. The papers and the police, they weren't allowed to publicly name him. However, it wasn't difficult at all, especially given this parade at his school, and because, of course, the rumours that were going around the town, even though there were rumours about Deon and about him annihilating his family, there were rumours about Don as well. So they knew that this was Don. It didn't need to be said. Don was granted bail, and the reason being is because he wanted to go back to school. He had been a good boy since these murders. He hadn't killed anyone else. His ever-present family had been doting on him as well. They had been bringing him gifts and food because apparently Don didn't like the food in the jail. He was also shielded from the media, so he wasn't photographed, which the people of Griekwastad felt was bias, either because of the fact that he was from a wealthy family, maybe because he was a minor, but he seemed to have been treated not so much like a celebrity, but he was treated with a little bit more dignity and respect than many people who are accused of murder are treated. Understandably though, the school were not happy with the fact that this boy had been granted bail and could potentially be allowed back to the school. But Don's legal team reapplied, and it was agreed that he would remain enrolled at the school, but he wouldn't attend the school. He would actually basically be a correspondence student. He would actually complete his assignments and then post them, or he would have his schoolwork posted to him. The state also challenged the bail decision. They wanted to have it overturned. They didn't feel that this boy who'd been accused of killing 3 members of his own family should be allowed out on bail. But it was rejected, and Don was free. Well, as free as he could be. As with all bails, there are conditions, and one of the conditions for Don's bail was that he wasn't allowed to go anywhere, so he had to stay in Griekwastad. Now, this shows how arrogant he was following the murders. Not long after the murders happened, Don messaged a friend of his who had invited Don to spend Christmas with him. I'm not quite sure where it was, but somewhere else. Don's parents had said no. Don had messaged his friend after the murders and had said that this year he would be able to spend Christmas with him. Nothing could stop him, and he would be very rich. And because of the bail conditions, that wasn't going to happen. So the murders had happened in April 2012. Don had been arrested 4 months later, or 4.5 months later, in August, but the trial didn't actually start until March of 2013. And Don, of course, pleaded not guilty. And with all the evidence that we've covered in the case so far, as you can imagine, there was so much evidence against Don. But still, the defense tried and tried and tried to push that this was a farm murder. One interesting point was the discovery of the rifle and the revolver at the gate of the property. Don said that as he was driving the bakkie, he saw them and picked them up and took them with him. The guns were actually splattered with blood and goodness knows what else. They were quite sticky and quite wet. If they'd been on the ground, they would have had gravel, they would have had dirt, they would have had grass, they would have, had all kinds of stuff on them, but there wasn't anything on them. Also, why would the perpetrator drop the very murder weapons which would have their fingerprints on them? The police's footage of the murder scene after they arrived was played to the court, and it was observed how lived in this house was. There were used plates and a casserole dish. There was a sideboard which had loads of books and goodness knows what else on them. There was laundry that was out that was half done. The television was also still on. Grass stains on Marthella's back showed that she had been laying on the ground whilst bleeding because the grass had stuck to her. There was spatter outside of the house and dripping on the tiles as going in, showing that something had happened outside, as well as where that pool of blood was, where there was a tree. What was also telling was that Don had not at any point checked on his parents to see if they were alive. He said he knew they were dead, but he hadn't even checked for a pulse. Marthella, her blood was shown on both of her parents, so it showed that she had at least tried to see if either of them were alive. The gunshot residue and the splatter on the shirt, and the fact that the shirt was ripped, it shows that Don had struggled with someone because that was accounted by his scratch, that Marthella had ferociously fought with him. She fought for her life, and in doing so, she had torn his t-shirt. Don also took the stand in his own defense. This is not something that an attorney will advise their client to do. But Don, he was described as being very arrogant in the court. He seemed to be of the opinion that because he had such great support from his family, many of whom still believed he was innocent, he seemed to think that he'd be okay, that he'd just be able to answer the questions. But there were so many questions put to him, he could not answer. He maintained that he was in the barn at 6:30 when he heard the first gunshots. However, there was evidence on Christelle's phone that she had actually messaged her sister at 18:34. That would therefore leave at the most 23 minutes for the murders to take place and for Don to arrive at the police station. He says he was in the barn, he heard the shots, he waited. Even though there were many tools and heavy objects around him, he didn't take any of them just in case he was ambushed in there. He didn't use his phone, which he had with him while he was in the barn. The defense's argument for the shirt being torn was that as Don cradled Marthella, she'd grabbed him, and as he pushed her away, her grip hadn't loosened, and that's how it was torn. This didn't hold up weight because this shirt, it's not the kind of shirt that you can tear easily. And many people in the jury were actually asked to rip a similar type of shirt, and they couldn't. It could only be explained that this kind of tear would have been from somebody who wasn't dying or just on the cusp of dying, but someone who was desperate for their life. The defense also jumped on the fact that Don's hand gunshot residue test was negative, but he had washed his hands, so this had likely got rid of any gunshot residue. The shirt itself was a big deal because it didn't have pooling of blood or much of that at all. A lot of it was splatters, as I mentioned before. He would have had to have been very near to her while blood was spurting out of her, or he was near her when the gun was fired and it hit her in the chest. It was also observed that in Don's bedroom there were several t-shirts all over the floor. It indicated that Don had not only just grabbed the first untorn shirt that he could find, but he was looking for a particular shirt. Don recounted what he had done that day. He said he went into the barn at about 6:30, maybe just before, and pretty much immediately he heard a whole round of gunshots, and this frightened him. He hid 10 minutes, 15 minutes. He then went into the house, found his sister dying, his parents already dead. He cradled her, he pushed her away, he went to change his shirt, got into the car, drove to the gate, picked up the guns, then drove to the staff house, warned them, and then drove all the way into town. Because there were 2 different types of guns used, he would have had to have heard different types of shots, and he hadn't said that. So the way he argued this, he said, after Marthella had died in his arms, he ran back to the barn and heard more gunshots. And then he ran back in. The victims had all been shot already dying, and Marthella had died, all been shot with different guns. Another time he said that it was the second time he entered into the property that Marthella died in his arms. He kept changing his story. Every time a new thing was put to him, he would always change his story. He was asked, why did you not just use the phone and call for help? His answer was, well, if the perpetrators were close, I didn't want to be here, I wanted to drive away. That doesn't hold water either. you hide, you arm yourself, you call for help regardless, because if the perpetrators are close by, the police need to apprehend them. The state also wanted to prove that this was a premeditated murder. This was not him just doing this on a whim. This wasn't spur of the moment, it was planned. But how far in advance wasn't really clear. Don's account of him being in the barn anyway was difficult to understand. The place in the barn that he said he was actually was in direct view of where Marthella had ran out and collapsed under the tree, yet he said he saw and heard nothing. Didn't hear his sister scream, didn't see the attacker, didn't see her fighting with the attacker. There was something else circumstantial that was put forward as part of the prosecution, although it's not damning in itself, was that Don, who was no stranger to firearms, he was speaking louder than normal while he was at the restaurant with his family. Some people speculate that this was due to distress, if he were innocent. But another possibility is that he had been very close, because he had fired guns, and it had caused a slight deafness. Now that can happen if you shoot a gun or you're near a gun without auditory protection. Text message evidence also came from Don, not long, literally hours or the very next day after the murder. Don had messaged a friend of his and told him that he was a suspect. There had been no mention of suspects at all at this point. It was a long time before the police actually said anything to Don or to anyone close to Don. A bit before he was arrested, but not as close as a few hours. When the friend asked if there were any other DNA or fingerprints present at the crime scene other than his own, Don said, "No, just mine." They also looked at Don's phone records. He had previously invited a friend to stay over that night, but the friend had cancelled. But leading up to the murders, Don had been phoning this friend repeatedly. Either he was double checking the friend wasn't going to come over, or he wanted his friend to come over, maybe in a way to give him a reason not to kill his family, a way for him to get that idea out of his head, or to be a witness. Don's defense also tried to put forward a motive for a farm attack happening. Yes, guns were left. Yes, wallets and cash and the cars and everything was left. But he says that there was a money bag in the safe and that had been taken. Now the safe was left open when the police arrived and there was a money bag there, it was empty. And Don thought that was proof that they had taken the cash and gone. The only thing is, that money bag was kept at the back of the safe behind the guns and other items. It wouldn't have been easy to have just taken that money bag out. And what another podcaster has quite rightly pointed out is, why leave the bag? Why unload it? You would get the hell out as quickly as you can. You would pick up the bag and you'd go. Don had also told the police and the court that he had actively gone to the staff house and gone up to them to tell them that there was an attacker on the farm. But the staff there said differently. The staff said they flagged him down after seeing him driving, which they thought was odd, and he only called to them from the car. He didn't actually get out. The defense also tried to say that the injury to Marthella's genitalia was caused by her either using a tampon, her scratching herself, an infection, horse riding. So many things were put forward, but the judge was having none of it. He said, "Will you stop with this ridiculous behaviour?" Evidence that the pathologist put forward was damning in terms of evidence of previous rape. Earlier that day, with it being Good Friday, the family had understandably attended church. They went home, they had some food, and apparently Don had gone out and he'd shot some meerkat. That was another thing the defence says about him getting gunshot residue on himself. That's where it come from. Quite possibly. When Don had come back, Marthella and Don went out and rode their horses. It was either during a time that they were dismounted or right after that this is when Don raped his sister. There were scratch marks found, fresh scratch marks on her lower back, and that, they said, showed somebody forcefully dragging their fingers down her as they were removing her clothes. Afterwards, the family watched buck drink at the river, which was a tradition they had. It was something they did every day. and then went inside, had some dinner. Deon, Don and Marthella were watching television while Christelle did some work at her laptop. At some point, Don excused himself. The gun safe was always unlocked because Don would often take out a gun and go out and shoot while game, or it wasn't unusual for that to happen. He got the revolver, loaded it, went downstairs, and without saying anything, shot his mother from behind. His sister panicked. She either ran into the room from somewhere else or she was already in there watching television. And Don shot her twice in the chest. His father got up, was moving towards him. He shot his father. His father fell down. Marthella then ran out of the house. He followed her, and then Marthella collapsed under the tree. They had a struggle. He hit her in the head. He got up and went into the house, or he took her with him. Marthella then tried to find some sign of life from her parents. She tried to get to the phone. Her blood was actually found on the landline as it was off the hook. She then collapsed on the floor. Don then shot 2 rounds into his father's head, 1 more into his mother's head, and 2 at Marthella's face. Then he went and put on another shirt, and then got in the car and drove. He didn't have to pause to pick up guns, he already had them. He didn't get out of the car, he just called out to the farm workers, again saving himself a little bit more time. This is what the prosecution believe happened. Even though he was found guilty and the maximum sentence he could face would be 25 years for that type of charge, because he was a minor, maximum is 20. And he could potentially be paroled after serving half his sentence. So he was sentenced in 2014, just before his 18th birthday. That means he will be eligible for parole in 2.5 years. He will be around 28 years old, or nearly 28 years old. And also what sickens me is that even though South Africa has a law which means that if someone murders someone else to inherit, they are immediately disinherited. Deon's father, who's also called Don, found a legal loophole and he put the money in trust. So this means that Don can legally inherit his father's estate because it would be considered a donation and not an inheritance. He will receive 23 million rand. That is about 15 million US dollars, or 11.6 UK pounds sterling. I don't think he should get any of it. He doesn't deserve it. I think 10 years in prison is not a punishment. At the age of 28, he can get out. He can inherit this place. He can have all this money. You know, within 10 years of him getting out when he's 38, what would the 10 years in prison have meant to him then? He killed his family and now he's wealthy. There are so many questions about this case. What had compelled him to do this? Yes, he may have wanted to silence his sister, but why kill his parents? The main motive put forward by the judge was that it did center around Marthella. She received a lot more punishment than her parents did, and she also had to watch her parents be murdered before she finally was, so she knew what was coming. So she had a lot of mental torture as well as physical torture. There is speculation about why Don had been raping his sister. The extended family have said that they didn't observe there to be any sibling rivalry. Some people say otherwise, because Marthella was, in many people's eyes, she was kind of the star of that family. She was going places because she did so well at school. She was such a social, lovely, kind person. She wasn't conceited. She was well loved by the family, by her friends, by her school. She was beautiful. She was good at anything she did. It seemed that she was the perfect child, and that Don may have felt, wrongly in my opinion, that he wasn't good enough, that Marthella was outshining him, that he resented how wonderful she was in the eyes of the family, that even though that wouldn't have been their intention to make him feel less than, he probably did feel less than. There may have been some resentment towards his father. Raping his sister wasn't so much sexual attraction, even though that's been speculated, because he did mention that Marthella to him was the most beautiful person he'd ever seen. And the fact that her face was so injured that he didn't want to look her beautiful face anymore. But also it's to do with dominance, taking something away from her because he felt that she was outshining him. A lot of people believe that virginity means that you are pure, And if you're not, you're damaged, or there's something wrong with you, or you've had your innocence taken, all of that. He probably felt that by taking his sister's virginity, he had taken the one last sacred thing that she had, because this was a religious family, let's not forget. A week after the murders, Don Steenkamp took place in a tent pegging competition, and he insisted on riding Marthella's horse. This sibling rivalry or jealousy also may explain why he wanted to ride her horse. He wanted everything that was hers so that he could succeed at things like tent pegging the way that she would. Don also had the audacity to say that his own father had been raping his sister, not him, and that it was consensual. There is no evidence whatsoever that Deon was ever inappropriate with Marthella. Don also voiced his opinions before the murders that he didn't like how the farm was ran. He wanted things to be changed. He could inherit, he can get rid of witnesses, he can get rid of Marthella, he can have a fresh start. And he probably believed that because he was a young, sweet, good-looking kid that he could get away with this. He genuinely believed he could. The parents dying is another thing that I can't really wrap my head around. He adored his mother, and he seemed to have been kinder to her, when he killed her. It's possible that the parents were killed because if he had killed just his sister, he probably thought he couldn't have got away with it. And if his parents found out that he'd killed his sister, he would have been disinherited. And if the parents found out that he had raped his sister, either whether she had died or not, he would have been disinherited. He needed to get rid of everybody. He did not score within the normal threshold of psychopathy on the standard psychopathy test. But don't forget, at the time of this, he was still in his sort of mid to slightly late teens. He's still growing. He is a murderer, a family annihilator. He didn't seem to have any care whatsoever for his family. He showed no emotion in the courtroom. And yes, he may not have intentionally shown it, but he didn't say anything to anyone about how he missed them. And to this day, he still hasn't admitted it, he still hasn't apologized, he still hasn't said why. Many members of the Steenkamp's extended family, they strongly dispute that there was any abuse in this house, that there was any favoritism, that everything was, all good. But you don't know what happens behind closed doors, and sometimes how you think people see you in your mind may not be how they really see you. So Don may have thought that his sister in everybody's eyes was better than him, but that's probably not what they thought. I personally do believe that he is psychopathic. His eyes are just empty. I don't think anyone, even 15 years old, even though he was a child, he wasn't exactly a small child. He knew what he was doing, and for him to have been raping his sister at that young age, it speaks volumes. I don't think he should ever get out, and it makes me angry that he will be a rich man when he's let out. This case has been difficult to research. It's been difficult to film. I have no words. I really don't. All I can say is I hope that Don does not reoffend. I sincerely hope he doesn't. Thank you very much for watching, and good night.